Ed Miliband talks about the need to get off gas and the need to do everything with renewables. And what's even more stupid is we keep subsidising more solar farms to build more of these things that are breaking the grid. Then we're going to have to spend billions of pounds fixing the threats that this brings to the grid. This whole thing is extremely stupid, and it's being pushed by people who don't understand the engineering. It would lead to blackouts.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. The Iran war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz are continuing to wreak havoc with the global economy. And according to the IMF, no country is going to be worse affected by this than Great Britain in terms of both lost growth and inflation. Of course, at the heart of all this is the price and supply of energy. And that's why there is no one I'd rather be talking to at the moment than independent energy consultant Kathryn Porter. Kathryn, welcome back to the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much for coming on. First off, just to give people a bit of background if they don't know already, why is the Strait of Hormuz so important to the energy supplies of a country thousands of miles away like the UK?
Well, I mean, it is and it isn't. The Strait of Hormuz is a major transit route for crude oil. You've got tankers of oil coming out of the producing countries in the Gulf and then going through the Strait of Hormuz, which is a very narrow channel of water and very easy to disrupt. It's quite strategically sort of vulnerable in that way. And then that oil is going on to refineries. Our real constraint actually is refinery capacity, refinery access. We're only down to 4 refineries here in the UK, but not all refineries are made equal. They are configured differently to take different grades of crude. So some are more configured for light sweet crude, some are more configured for sour heavy crude. European refineries tend to be much more geared towards production of gasoline. And which is why actually we're now seeing a bigger constraint around diesel. Diesel's a slightly heavier distillate than gasoline. And you can't easily change between those distillates within your refinery. You can tweak a little bit, you can fine tune a little bit, but essentially when you build the refinery in the first place, which is a very capital intensive activity, you essentially define both the input crude that you will take and then the slate that you expect to get at the end of it. And that is the suite of refined products from the fractional distillation process. So once that's been set up, there's not really a huge amount you can do to change it. So if there are disruptions to the supply of your feedstock, which is crude oil and the right type of crude oil for your refinery, then you might find that you've got issues with supply of products at the other end.
And people will have heard many times, particularly from this government, that the world is moving away from fossil fuels. The UK in particular is transitioning away from oil and gas. First of all, are we actually transitioning away from fossil fuels? Are we using less of them? Is that even remotely true?
So, I mean, people conflate two things here. They conflate electricity with energy. Electricity in the UK is just under 20% of our total energy demand. So there's a huge amount that we're using of energy that we're using that simply isn't electricity and therefore cannot be produced by renewables. And renewables isn't even all of our electricity. We're still using an awful lot of gas in our electricity grid. We're not using, so we use a little bit of oil, nothing on the transmission system, and we're not using coal anymore. But if you look at our economy as a whole, we're still using a lot of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels dominate transport, they dominate heating, and they dominate industry. And, it's actually quite pathetic that Ed Miliband talks about the need to get off gas and the need to do everything with renewables. And obviously that only is for electricity. There's only one sector where we actually have any sort of electrification plan, and that's domestic heating. But it will take 47 years to install heat pumps in all homes based on the government's target installation rate. And we're not anywhere close to meeting that rate. So it's pretty clear, even from government policy and strategy, that we're going to need fossil fuels for a very long time to come. And so it's pretty disappointing that they don't appear to have any strategy to secure those, to make sure that we can reliably get cheap and secure access to oil and gas, the oil and gas that we're obviously going to need for decades to come.
And if we were to just take electricity, for instance, is it possible to completely transition away from fossil fuels? And is it desirable, would it be desirable anyway?
So if you had a lot more nuclear than we do, I mean, in theory, you could. The French grid operates almost entirely on nuclear and hydro. We don't really have the capacity for as much hydro as they have in France. So it is possible to construct grids that don't rely on wind and solar. I mean, look at Tasmania, for example. They're pretty much 100% hydro. So is Norway. But that's synchronous generation. You can't do it with wind and solar. It's disappointing how often I have to tell people this. Our electricity grids are designed for alternating current. Wind and solar and batteries are all direct current. And the technology to do direct current at anything other than a microgrid doesn't exist. And yes, people talk about grid forming inverters and all the rest of it. They haven't yet been invented to perform at the level that they would need to. And the progress has been actually quite slow. In Australia, they've been trying to get this to work since about 2018, and they haven't really made much progress. Yes, they have some grid forming inverters on the grid, but they're not actually forming the grid. And they've found that in fault conditions, they tend to revert to following. So right now, we do not have the technologies to run large-scale grids without conventional generation. So that means you need either gas, coal, oil, nuclear, or hydroelectric, or anything else that will drive a conventional turbine, like geothermal, for example, in order to make your grid work. And we don't have access to those other forms of renewable generation. We have a little bit of hydro, we have a very small amount of geothermal, but we don't really have very much scope for increasing that. So unless we're going to build a huge amount of nuclear at a speed faster than we can currently achieve, mainly because of our dysfunctional regulatory environment, then we're going to have to keep using gas. And there's also a possibility we might have to build more coal.
And I want to talk a little bit about the North Sea, because it feels as if there's a lot of myths being floated around, a lot of misinformation, most of it spread by the British government, it's fair to say. And I wonder if we could take some of those myths in turn. So myth number one would be, well, there's not enough oil and gas, so what's the point of extracting it? What would you say to that?
Okay, well, when somebody's in their 80s, do we just kill them because they're a bit old and there's not much point in them, in giving them medical care or feeding them? Because that is effectively the same argument. It's just not worth bothering with. Let's not bother with old people then. Let's not invest in old infrastructure. As soon as something gets a bit old, let's just write it off and not bother with it anymore. Because why would you? I mean, it's just idiotic, right? Just because there's less available there to produce in the future than there has been in the past doesn't mean it's not worth doing. There is a lot of oil and gas left in the North Sea. And Norway has been making some big discoveries right adjacent to the UK continental shelf. Some of those discoveries quite likely extend into our territory. So it's insane not to maximise that. The fact that it might run out faster or it might not last forever is not an excuse, is not a justification. And in fact, any time you begin any sort of extraction, that asset then goes into decline. Like day one, you begin to exploit a new mine. Are you going to shut it on day two because it's now in decline? I don't think so. So these arguments just make no sense.
And myth number two might be, well, the price of oil, the price of gas, it's all set on global markets. Whatever you do in the UK, it makes absolutely no difference to your energy bills on the other end.
Okay, I mean, again, complete nonsense, right? Okay, there is no global price for gas. There are three regional benchmarks that are significant. There's the US, which is far cheaper than anywhere else. And then you have the main European benchmark, tidal transfer facility based in the Netherlands, and the main Asian benchmark, the Japan-Korea marker, that primarily sets prices in Asia. And TTF and JKM kind of takes in turns depending on which one's, for one is being higher than the other. But the British gas price, national balancing point, typically trades at a discount to the European gas price. On average, it's about 5 to 7% a year. In the winter, we're closer to parity, but in the summer, we're quite significantly below. So it's just a lie to say that our gas price is set in international markets. If that was the case, there would be no difference between the British price and the European price. It would always be the same. The reason that it's not the same is we have our own production. We each, on the continent and us, have different methods of acquiring gas into our markets. And the connection between the two markets is quite limited. So, so that physical constraint means that price differential persists. Now, if we were to increase our oil and gas production in the North Sea, we could potentially displace liquefied natural gas from our grid in the summer altogether. And that would mean the pricing was only based on the North Sea, so our production and Norwegian production, and it would be a lot cheaper. It would also be a lot less carbon intensive. And a lot of people don't understand about marginal pricing. You hear it a lot in the electricity market, and people seem to think somebody on Twitter yesterday is described as being nutters for using gas to set the price of electricity. Well, I've got news for you, and I've got news for everybody listening to this. Every freely traded commodities market in the world uses marginal pricing to set the prices. The crude oil markets do, the gas markets do, the electricity markets do, the copper market does, the nickel market does, the wheat market does, the pork bellies market does. All of these markets price in the same way, using the marginal source of supply to set the market price. It is not some weird quirk of the British power market. And so bringing that back to gas, the most expensive LNG cargo sets the price at the NBP. If we displace the most expensive cargo, we will lower the price. And if we displace all of the cargoes, then of course we'll lower the price more significantly. And in the summer, that's absolutely achievable because we don't actually import that much LNG in the summer. So to say that our own production cannot lower prices is just not correct. It's not going to halve them. It's not going to be a dramatic reduction, but it will be a reduction. And at a time when we're all suffering with high prices, I think any reduction really is welcome.
And I suppose the related kind of myth is, or the objection to drilling in the North Sea is that, well, we have to export everything anyway. There's no guarantee that, it will go to British consumers. Again, it's this kind of global market idea that someone else will take it off us or pay us for it. And that's somehow a bad thing.
Okay, so I would really, really like to hear Ed Miliband explain how that works, right? Because you have a gas rig in the North Sea, and so what does he think happens to the gas that comes out of that well? Because I'll tell you what happens to it. It goes down a pipe. And where do those pipes go? They go to Britain. They don't go anywhere else. They go to Britain. So I don't know how he thinks that gas is getting into these international markets that he talks about. The gas comes out of the well in the North Sea, goes down a pipe into the British power grid, and then goes to homes and businesses. It's not going anywhere else. Now, theoretically, you could construct some deals where you would transit the British grid and then export it through the interconnectors. But as I said, the capacity on those pipes isn't that big. Right? And we do not have any capacity to liquefy gas in this country to export it by ship. So to say that we're selling our gas on the international markets is just completely wrong. The gas comes through the pipes, and the pipes only lead to the British market. Now, with oil, it's a bit different because it has to go to refineries, and most of the oil we produce gets refined in continental Europe and not in the UK. But we've closed all our refineries. We only have 4 left. So what do you think is going to happen? If you close all your domestic capacity, then obviously you're going to make yourself exposed. But this is not a fault of North Sea production. This is a fault of a failure of industrial strategy in recent decades.
People may have seen an interesting news story this week. NESO, the National Energy Systems Operator, have suggested that this coming summer, there may be an excess of solar power thanks to all the new solar farms that are being built. And they may even be giving out electricity for free. We may have too much electricity.
So it won't be for free. So that's the first thing. They will have to pay people to take it away. So how moronic is it that we're spending billions of pounds to build more solar farms when NESO is telling us that there's so much solar being generated in the summer that it's risking crashing the grid? Because that's what it means when you start to get free or negative prices. It means that your system is becoming unsafe. And a really good example of this was in the gas market in 2006. And I think people can probably relate to this better with gas than they can with electricity. So if you think of the gas grid as being a set of closed pipelines, if you put more gas into a pipeline system than you take out, then the pressure inside those pipes will rise and rise and rise to a point it becomes unsafe and you risk explosions. So because you can compress gas, that gives you some flexibility, but obviously there's a limit to that. There's only so far you can compress it. And that's why we balance the gas market every day. So every market participant has to inform the gas grid operator how much gas they're going to put into the grid every day and how much they're going to take out. And because of this ability to compress the gas and also the ability to store gas in the pipes, you have that flexibility of a day. So back in 2006, they were commissioning a new pipeline from a major gas field in the Norwegian, off the Norwegian coast called Ormen Lange. And this pipe, Lange Lead, was coming into Easington on the east coast of Britain. And there was some mistake in the nomination. So they suddenly sent an amount of gas that day, which was much bigger than the gas grid operator was expecting. So the GB gas grid was then flooded with all of this gas. And obviously then you have this safety concern. So what the grid operator had to do then was pay people to take gas off the grid. It was so dangerous that you had to get rid of the gas at any cost. So then they phoned up the gas power stations and said, you need to fire up to use up this gas because we've got too much gas and it's a safety risk. So then the gas power stations fired up to consume the gas. And, the gas grid then was saved. And that manifested from a market perspective as negative prices because they said, we will pay you to take this gas off the grid because keeping it on the grid is too big a risk. It's a safety risk. It's going outside of our tolerance parameters. And therefore, we need to pay money to get rid of it. So you have the same situation in the electricity market, but you can't compress electricity. So you've got much less flexibility and you can't store it in the wires the way you can store gas in the pipes. So we balance our electricity markets in half-hour chunks, not one-day chunks the way we do with the gas market. And in the same way that you have pressure in gas, you also kind of have it in electricity. So if you put more generation onto the grid than you take off, the speed of your alternating current, so that's the rate at which current and voltage change in your alternating current cycle, starts to speed up. In the same, and conversely, if you're taking out too much, if demand is bigger than supply, then the frequency will slow down. Now, actually, you're not going to get stuff blowing up from pressure the way you would in the gas grid, but equipment will break. Electrical equipment is very sensitive to this frequency phenomenon, and if it goes too high or too low, they will disconnect. They've got protection measures that will cause them to disconnect. And it's so relevant that NESO has a statutory duty to keep this frequency at 50 hertz plus or minus 1%. So it's a fairly narrow band that they have to play with. So if you're suddenly flooding the market with excess solar power, what happens is that the frequency of the grid goes up and it starts to go up more than that 1%. And so then NESO is like, oh my goodness, we've got so much solar now that we can't keep the grid stable. If we don't do something, we're going to get all sorts of equipment disconnecting, substations disconnecting, other forms of power generation disconnecting, major sources of load disconnecting. It would lead to blackouts. So it might sound ridiculous that too much electricity could lead to a blackout, but it absolutely could, because it's like having too much gas in the gas grid, which cause your gas grid to break. Too much electricity in the electricity grid will also cause the electricity grid to break. And so NESO then has to find ways of getting rid of this electricity. Now, unfortunately, most of the solar is connected to the low voltage networks, which NESO doesn't control. So unlike if you had too much wind, NESO can just basically phone them up and say, you've got to turn off, and they will pay them some compensation for that, but they will disconnect them. It can't disconnect the solar on the low voltage network because it doesn't control it. In fact, it can't even see it. All it can see is the effects that it reduces demand on the transmission system. That's the way it looks to NESO. It looks as if demand has dropped because now it's being met locally instead of being met from the transmission system. And this makes the transmission system extremely fragile. It makes it very, very difficult to operate. And NESO only has two levers it can pull here. It can try and export the excess electricity, or it makes people use it. Now, exporting is limited, A, by the number of cables we have, but also B, because if we have excess solar, there's a good chance that our connected markets do as well, particularly since most of them are further south than us. They get more sun anyway. So if we have a surplus, they're likely to have a surplus. And so they might not want to buy our spare electricity at any price if their market is also overloaded. So that really just leaves trying to make people use it up. And so this is where you're getting this narrative about free electricity or even getting paid to use the electricity. And it's not a good thing, because who's going to have the ability to do that? you might get some industry to do it, but from a domestic perspective, you're going to be paying the rich people who've got electric cars and heated swimming pools and all the rest of it. And you will pay them money, and that money will be taken from everyone else. So you're actually increasing the cost of operating the grid. So, and nobody's going to have free electricity anyway, because this is only at the wholesale level. You still have to pay for electricity infrastructure. You still have to pay all the subsidies. You still have to pay the actual cost of distributing the electricity, the cost of the suppliers have to do metering and call centers and all the rest of it. So those costs don't go away. You know, the VAT doesn't go away just because you've got too much electricity that day. So it's a real technical challenge. And it's one that, you know, so it's very frustrating, actually, to see people celebrating this, saying, oh, this is amazing. It's so great. We're going to have all this free electricity. No, what it means is you're breaking the grid. You're breaking the grid and you're making it more expensive to keep the grid operating safely. And what's even more stupid is we keep subsidizing more solar farms. So you're saying that we've got so much of this now, it's causing a risk that we're going to break the grid, but we're going to subsidize even more. We're going to pay billions of pounds to build more of these things that are breaking the grid. Then we're going to have to spend billions of pounds fixing the threats that this brings to the grid. And then we're going to have to spend billions of pounds subsidizing consumers because they can't afford all the billions we just spent already. So this whole thing is extremely stupid, and it's being pushed by people who don't understand the engineering and who are not engaging with the engineering. I've been offering free training courses to any member of the British Parliament that wants it, whether in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. Not a single Labour MP or peer has reached out. And I've offered this on social media. I've had independent MPs, I've had Conservative MPs and peers. I did a big group of Conservative peers last week in the House of Lords, and not a single Labour MP or peer has reached out. So they're going around, they're pushing these policies that they don't understand. They fundamentally don't understand. They are breaking the grid, and they're celebrating they're breaking the grid because they're too dumb or too lazy to engage with the engineering.
Yeah, because I mean the narrative around renewables, whether it's wind or solar, is is threefold. It's going to be cheaper, it's going to be more secure, and it's going to be safer. Bizarrely, and yet, obviously, it's doing the exact opposite of all of those things.
Not one of those things is true. Not one of those things is true. And I was at a dinner the other day when there was somebody there from one of the big suppliers, one of the big challenger suppliers. And I was saying that renewables aren't cheap. And we had this whole discussion and I was giving all this evidence. And then she turned to me and said, oh, don't you believe in climate change? I'm like, what does that have to do with it? We were discussing economics, right? So if you want to make the argument that we have to have renewables because they're better for the climate, irrespective of the cost, that's a completely different discussion to have. But don't be telling me they're cheap when they aren't. And actually pivoting that conversation to, oh, don't you believe in climate change, immediately surrenders the economic argument. So if you believe that we need renewables because you think they're better for the climate, which I actually disagree that they're better for the climate, but if you want to make the argument that we need to spend more money to protect the climate, that is a legitimate argument to make. But then it's not the argument that they're cheap. And we have to get away from these lies about renewables being cheap. The wind and the sun are free. The machines to make that free wind and solar energy into electricity are expensive. They are intermittent. Solar in this country works 10% of the time. Wind works a third of the time. So you need backup. You have to spend billions of pounds for other generational storage to be available to operate when the wind and solar isn't available. They have low energy density. That means they need a lot more wires to connect them up. They have also located, typically, particularly with offshore wind, in places where there is no existing grid infrastructure. That costs a lot of money, billions of pounds, to connect and operate that additional grid infrastructure. Then you have the issue of managing that real-time intermittency. Every gust of wind, every cloud disturbs that moment-to-moment balance between generation and supply and moves that grid frequency, which is such a sensitive parameter. And so we're spending billions of pounds a year more to manage that variability than we would with a conventional system. So it is costing us billions and billions of pounds a year more to operate a grid with high levels of intermittent renewable generation. Now, if we were going to do lots of hydro, then that would be different because hydro is dispatchable, controllable. It generates alternating current in a native way. and it's very secure, but we just do not have the ability to build a lot more hydro. You would have to flood areas of land. We just don't. We have high population density and not a lot of land available that we could flood. Although flooding the land would be far more useful than putting solar farms on it. So we have to work with what we've got. And if we want to decarbonise our electricity system, then nuclear really is the lowest cost option. But we do actually need to do what South Korea does and build it at 5 or 6 billion US dollars instead of the 48 billion pounds that we're spending because of our idiotic approach to regulation.
And returning to the crisis at hand, of course, I know you wouldn't start from where we are in the UK, given all the stupid decisions that have been made that you've laid out very comprehensively there. But what are some immediate policies that a government could enact that might ease the pressure on people's energy bills or fuel costs?
Cut the fuel duty, for goodness sake. Well, it's quite infuriating that in the middle of March, there was an escalation in the Iran conflict. And the following day, you had Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and Ed Miliband all over the news accusing fuel retailers of profiteering. Now, there was clearly insufficient time for any evidence of profiteering to show up in the data. So they didn't say this because they identified profiteering was happening. They said it because they were playing political games, and either they had a genuine assumption that retailers would start profiteering, or they were just trying to make it sound like they were doing something. But of course, everyone then started pointing out that more than half of the price that we pay at the pump is duty. You pay the fuel duty and then you pay VAT on the fuel duty. They tax the tax, which is outrageous. So they should give VAT relief on fuel duty. They should lower fuel duty, and they should remove the escalator. So we haven't had fuel duty escalation in years and years and years. The Conservatives froze it, and Labour has removed that freeze, and they're supposed to be increasing fuel duty from the autumn. So they need to stop that. That's the first thing. A lot of people would have more money in their pockets if we paid less tax on fuel. Number two, in the gas and electricity markets, get rid of carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is not doing anything right now, and it's definitely not doing anything in the power sector because we've got rid of all the coal. So all it's doing now for gas-fired power generation, they're just paying an extra tax. It is the exact same thing as if gas prices went up. It makes no difference to whether you need to use the gas or not, because the gas is running when there's not enough wind and solar. So the cost of the gas then becomes irrelevant. The cost of the gas runs because it has to run. And by adding this extra tax onto the use of gas, you're just making it more expensive. You're not achieving anything. There's no possible decarbonisation that they can deliver to avoid that cost. So it is a pure tax that does not solve any sort of environmental benefit. All this is doing is putting money into the treasury. So that has to stop. Get rid of the carbon market. It is particularly in the power sector where it actually serves no purpose whatsoever. They need to deal with the subsidies. Now, Ed Miliband announced last week that he was going to restructure the legacy renewables obligations. Now, he announced this as getting off gas. I mean, it has absolutely nothing to do with gas. He's actually not getting off gas. He's not going to change marginal pricing. All he's going to do is he's made a small increase to the electricity generators levy, which will primarily affect the legacy nuclear power stations, which will be a bad thing, actually, because they're looking at making investments for life extensions. If they decide that they don't want to make those life extensions anymore, then that will elevate our blackout risk as we move towards the end of the decade. So that is not a smart choice. The other thing he wants to do is restructure the renewables obligation. Now, that is the legacy subsidy framework for large-scale generation. If you were to move those subsidies onto the contracts for difference, which is what he wants to do, on a like-for-like basis, so expiring at the same time that they're currently set to expire, you would basically give them twice as much in terms of subsidy as you've just offered in AR7, which was the most recent subsidy round. So that gives you a scale of the cost here. It would be about double. So what he's talking about is offering these generators an additional 20-year subsidy. So tear up the old subsidy, which is partway through its life. For some of those, so the last ones I think were in about 2018, 2019, thereabouts. I think the last payments are in 2037. But some of them are much older than that. Some of those older assets he's going to offer 20-year contracts, so you do not have 20 years of life left So it's very difficult to see how you're going to subsidise for offer a 20-year subsidy to an asset that maybe only has a 10-year economic life remaining. So I think there's going to be some real issues here. Now, but he's going to lock in from the date he changes these contracts, new 20-year subsidies. So some of those will have had subsidies of maybe 30 years. Their entire life will be subsidised. And it will increase the cost. So bizarrely, this thing that Miliband announced last week is probably going to raise bills. I think it will actually increase the policy cost element of bills, and it will definitely, in the long term, increase the amount that we have to spend on subsidies. So it is definitely not in the best interest of consumers, and it's been totally missold as a getting off gas thing when it has absolutely nothing to do with gas. He hasn't said he's going to change marginal pricing. He's literally just talking about moving the renewables obligation onto the contract. To really deal with cost, you could actually cancel the renewables obligation altogether. This is what the Conservatives have said. The way that the RO is structured within the legislation, you could just get rid of it. You don't need new primary legislation to do that. And they're not contracts. The contracts for difference is different because each generator enters into a bilateral contract with the government. So to change any one, you'd have to do it on a bilateral basis, whereas the renewables obligation isn't. You could use statutory instruments and so on to address that. So you could just cancel it. And why not? Right? Because if wind is so cheap, wind and solar are so cheap, why can they not just stand on their own feet? Why do they require subsidies? We've been subsidising this for a long time. So I would cancel the renewables obligation. So I'd cancel the carbon pricing. I'd cancel the renewables obligation. I would also strictly enforce the decommissioning regulations that apply to renewable generators. They're not being enforced at the moment. They are supposed to provide capital or some forms of guarantees with a strong credit rating against their decommissioning liabilities, and just about nobody complies with this. We don't allow that sort of non-compliance in the North Sea for oil and gas. We shouldn't allow it for wind and solar. And I think if we started enforcing those rules, quite a few of those installations would close, and therefore that would reduce costs for consumers. Because there's a myth that people think that the more wind and solar we have, the lower our costs are. That is not true. The more wind and solar we have, the higher our costs are. And many of these projects have a net negative cost to consumers over the long term. So consumers will be better off without this stuff on the grid. So we should just get rid of it. We should close it. Now, the best way to close it without having to compensate people is enforce the rules. And if they can't comply with the rules and have to close, then so be it, right? They shouldn't be in the market if they can't follow the rules of the market. So that would also save cost. So these are some really quick ways that they could save cost. They could give VAT relief. That would take 5% off our bills straight away, because VAT on gas and electricity is 5%. They could get rid of the warm homes discount and move that into the benefit system. It is wealth redistribution. The people that don't get the discount pay the people who do effectively. So if you want to give low-income households additional support, it should just be done through the benefit system. It shouldn't be done through gas and electricity bills. So get rid of that. And, stop with the smart meter rollout here. At the moment, suppliers are paying fines because they can't persuade people to install smart meters. Smart meters are not mandatory for consumers, but it is mandatory for suppliers to meet installation targets, and they're getting fined for it. And obviously, the cost of those fines is then recovered through bills. So let's just stop it, right? Let's pause on any discretionary expenditure that does not have a clear value add. And if you can't persuade consumers that it's a value add to them to have a smart meter, then don't do it. So there's all of these different ways where we could take cost out of the system. And if we start closing some of those wind and solar farms, and we might find that we don't need all of the grid investment that's been scheduled. And so that will lower bills as well. It won't lower them today, but it will lower them down the line.
And talking of down the line, I mean, we've seen what a terrible energy policy looks like, and that's probably just about what the UK has ended up with. But what would a sensible energy policy, for the things that we want, which is, I think, cheap, abundant energy security, so that we're insulated from shocks like the Iran war. How would we go about building such a thing over the longer run?
Now we're facing really really serious constraints on supply chains. So how quickly can we build what we need to build is not really in our control. So what we have to do is prioritize things that work, things that have a proven track record. And I mentioned South Korea earlier. They've built 8 of their large nuclear reactor design. They've done 4 in South Korea, 4 in United Arab Emirates. The average build time was about 8.5 years. And the average cost, as I said, was between 5 and 6 billion US dollars. So this is about half the speed that it takes us to build, or EDF in general, and Westinghouse in the US. It's about twice as fast, and significantly cheaper. Now, even with this, what should have been the same reactor design. So EDF is just at the point of completing a European pressurized water reactor in Flamanville in France. And the all-in cost for that is somewhere around £23 billion. But Hinkley Point C, which should have been the same design, is going to cost about £47 billion by the time it's built, because the UK regulators required 7,000 design changes, because obviously the French nuclear regulators are cowboys who don't care about safety. And so we thought we knew better and had to make all of these extra changes. And the same in Finland. They built the same design in Finland. Clearly, the Finnish regulators are a completely incompetent bunch who don't know what they're doing, because they didn't add these 7,000 changes themselves. Just in case anybody missed the sarcasm there, I have the highest respect for the Finnish nuclear regulator. It's just crazy, right? We should stop doing that. So in fact, we have a memorandum of understanding with South Korea for nuclear cooperation. What we should actually do, if we were smart, is invite the South Koreans to come here, rewrite our regulations from scratch, and come with their people and their technology and start building half a dozen APR 1400s in Britain, starting at Wilver and Sizewell C. They haven't gone far enough with the EPR at Sizewell that they couldn't change course. But Wilver should definitely be a gigawatt scale project and not the SMRs that they're talking about. This is where I would start, and I would start funding it with public money. We have to stop wasting time here, and we've broken trust with the private markets when it comes to funding nuclear. So issue, nuclear bonds, refinance them after construction, because that is really the biggest risk that people are worried about. It would actually probably be financially profitable to do that anyway. Operating nuclear reactors is extremely profitable. There'll be a lot of people interested in participating in the capital at that point. So this would be, for me, the core of a long-term, stable electricity strategy in Britain. And then you need to supplement that. You're going to have to supplement, particularly in the short term, with fossil generation. Now, unfortunately, the lead times for new gas turbines are really long. And we have about a third of our fleet is at risk of closure because it was built in the 1990s and is just getting to end of life. So it might be the case that we have to build coal, because you can build coal power stations faster than you can build gas power stations. Now, I do not love coal. This is not my preferred choice, but I love blackouts even less. So I think we have to be extremely pragmatic about this. Focus on reliability and cost as the primary drivers. We saw in Iberia that people died in the blackouts, and that was really benign weather conditions. Winter blackouts in Britain would almost certainly have much higher fatality rates. So we really have to work hard to avoid that. So focus on nuclear as your long-term solution, and make sure that your gas fleet is in good enough shape or has support from coal, if that's what you have to do, to cover the grid in the meantime, so that you don't end up having to ration. Because my worry is, as we start seeing those older gas generators retire, then we will face rationing on low wind days.
Well, thank you very much for that, Kathryn Porter. Thanks for coming on the show.
You're very welcome.